Hi, and welcome to another edition of the NAIC Insights series. I'm your host, Bob Greene, and I am delighted to be joined today by Nicole Musicco, Chief Investment Officer for CalPERS. Welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Bob. It's great to be here today.
I have been looking forward to speaking with you and have really given a lot of thought to the things that are going to drive our conversation. So, why don't we start by having you tell the audience what your job entails as Chief Investment Officer at CalPERS?
Certainly, thank you. And again, thank you for having me on today. I've been really excited to chat with you. So my role as Chief Investment Officer at CalPERS, we have just over 460 billion of assets under management. And really our role is to make sure that we provide a pension for our 2 million members to retire with dignity. And we take that extremely seriously, and we're really honored, frankly, to have that role. And what that means is that we are thinking about everything from the strategic asset allocation, we're thinking about portfolio construction, we're thinking about how much or how little to put, how much capital to put to work in each of those asset classes. And as well, I'm thinking about everything from, do we have the right culture in place to be a high performing team, for example? Do we have the right data and tech strategy in place to make sure we can be a best in class pension provider? And so it really is a full spectrum of responsibilities that a chief investment officer at CalPERS has. But I do that with an extremely talented team surrounding me who I learn from every day as well.
That's outstanding. So, let me start with the first question. In your experience, what do you see as the most significant investment challenge currently facing CalPERS, and how do you believe it can be effectively addressed?
Well, we have the task of investing almost $500 billion. And so investing at scale for anyone is, it's always a big challenge. And thinking about how we appropriately put the capital to work across asset classes, across geographies, in order to make our close to 7% return that we need in order to pay those pensions. And so our biggest challenge today is making sure that we're evolving into our strategic asset allocation that we really formalized as of July 1 last year, which is much more heavily focused on private market investing, for example, with the intent of having higher risk adjusted returns over the long run so that we can actually hit the 6.8 plus percent returns that are needed to pay those pensions. So it's really it's a large pool of capital, which means it's a larger challenge. But again, we do have the tools in place in order to achieve that. And we've been making great strides into executing our most recent strategic asset allocation.
So, speaking of asset allocation, let's talk a little bit about your various asset classes. So, walk us through the asset classes that CalPERS is focused on and the internal and external resources that you utilize to execute in that space.
Sure. Well, like most traditional larger pension plans, we really run the spectrum of asset classes that we're investing in. So, as you can imagine, we have a lot of capital deployed today into public equities and fixed income, but we also are moving into much more of a concentrated focus into private markets. And within private markets, it's everything from real estate, infrastructure, private equity, which also entails venture capital, and private credit, which is a new asset allocation for us just as of a year ago.
That's outstanding. So, when I think of the NAIC world and the things that are most interesting to our audience, it's always the alternatives. That's the space that we cover. So, let's talk a little bit about the alternatives. CalPERS was one of the first large public pension plans to invest broadly in alternatives. You guys have always been a leader in a number of different ways in a number of different categories. But talk a little bit about the challenge of investing in illiquid strategies and strategies that, frankly, can take a lot longer to realize their return potential.
Sure. I mean, you touched on a few very important considerations, if you will, when you are looking through the lens of a private market strategy at the end of the day. And you're correct in saying that CalPERS was one of the first, and frankly, probably put a bunch of the household name brands today in business back in the day in private markets. Uh, Real estate has been a very long-standing asset class for CalPERS, and over the years, well before I arrived, there was a lot of work to make sure we are right-sizing that program and really picking, a dozen or so real strategic partners in that asset class. Infrastructure is a newer asset class for us, and we're really starting to think more broadly about the types of infrastructure assets that we'd like to deploy our capital into. Energy transition as a topic, which we can chat about in a bit, is one area that we're looking at through the lens of infrastructure investing. And then private equity, we absolutely were very early day investors in private equity at CalPERS, but we did take a bit of a pause. For the most part, almost a decade pause, where we really did need to start ramping up again over just the last few years. And even more recently, since I joined, really leaning into co-investing. And co-investing at the end of the day is important not only for the appropriate return profile, but equally important for the cost structure overall of private equity. And so we've been able to bring on talent to really help us lean into that co-investing program that you'll start to see more of, not only in private equity, but also in our infrastructure program and certainly in our private credit program, where our team has really since inception deployed both into managers as well as into co-investments.
So when you deal with that many asset classes, obviously you rely on a lot of staff. CalPERS has a big team, one of the largest in the world, frankly, and you also rely on a lot of managers. Can you talk
Mhm.
about the dependencies and how you as CIO have to manage and blend and engage different third parties, if you will, to make sure that you achieve that all important assumed rate of return?
Sure. Yeah. The external manager or the manager versus direct investing approach is certainly alive and well here at CalPERS. And we really do rely on and depend on trusted partners to help us achieve our return target of the 7% overall. The partnerships that we've been really leaning into in the last few years really is kind of broken down by asset class. We use different approaches, if you will. So as I mentioned, for real estate as well as for infrastructure, which is run under one umbrella under Sarah Core, we call it our Real Assets program. And in both of those strategies, we really have a very concentrated group of managers to really help us achieve our strategy overall, but also work with us extremely closely to help us really learn the business alongside those partners. In private equity, given the size of the pool, it's a much broader set of managers at the end of the day, meaning there are more of them, both for the private equity strategy as well as the venture strategy. But again, we've really started to take a more concentrated look at deploying the capital into partners where we feel like there's a true strategic partnership. And what I mean by that, rather than it just being a buzzword, is not only do we want to have our capital returning the appropriate risk adjusted returns, we want to make sure that we're benefiting from leveraging the learnings, if you will, from those partners. And so we're spending more time working alongside them, for example, for co-investments. We're spending a lot more time with them thinking about investable themes that we could be investing in together. And in some cases, we're even being more entrepreneurial, if you will, in creating new strategies alongside them so that we can both benefit from those strategic partnerships.
So, Nicole, we've probed a little bit about the CIO role and the challenges that you have day to day and longer term. But I actually want to take the opportunity, and we do this in Insights. I want to go back because I want to hear more about your personal story and your journey for how you got here. So, talk to us a little bit about where your career started, maybe what the initial aspirations were, and how that's working out now.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start even one step before, before I knew that I wanted to be an investment professional. I actually thought I wanted to be a medical doctor, a sports medical doctor, to be precise. And it wasn't until my third year of university when we had an anatomy course with our own cadavers,
Mhm.
where I basically fainted, decided I could never deal with broken bones, and so I was in a bit of trouble. I needed to pivot at that point and figure out what I was going to do with my university degree, et cetera. But all kidding aside from there, that really led me into business school, which then led me into kind of the realm of possible within capital markets. And I felt really fortunate to have exposure very early in my career to having a better understanding of the realm of possible within capital markets. And in fact, I really started my first summer job on a trading floor because, again, I was test driving whether maybe trading was something for me or investment banking, and then ultimately private equity. And I really did take that path. My first real job post undergrad was working for Solomon Smith Barney, which then became Citigroup before I left. And that was a traditional investment banking analyst role on Wall Street where I just learned a ton. And then when I went back and did my MBA at Western in Canada, I had a purview, if you will, into what private equity was all about. And so I pretty much set my sights on entering into the field of private equity right out of grad school. And that's when I joined Ontario Teachers Pension Plan, which at the time was very uniquely positioned as a Canadian pension plan because we wearing my old Ontario Teachers hat, were one of the first, if not the first, of the Canadian plans to start direct investing in private equity. And so right out of university, I had the great opportunity to learn the direct investing business right out of the gate. And I spent 16 years there at Ontario Teachers, predominantly in private equity, but also moved to Asia to open an Asia office for Ontario Teachers, and then came back and ran the public equity side of the program. And that was really my first foray, if you will, over that 16-year period, predominantly focused on private equity.
That is an outstanding background, and I'm particularly intrigued about the fact that you worked in Canada. That in the U.S. we're so U.S. domestic focused. We oftentimes don't think about what other countries and other pension plans in other countries are facing. Talk to me a little bit
Mhm.
about the differences between Ontario teachers and CalPERS, the things that Ontario teachers that you learned there that you like about the Maple 8 approach to doing business versus how we may do things in the US.
Sure. I think when people try to articulate the difference between the two pension systems, if you will, Canada versus many of the US plans, really starts with the governance. The governance structure in Canada, for the most part, across the Maple 8, as you referred to, the 8 largest pension plans in Canada, it really is a governance structure that starts with an arm's length relationship with from government, as well as a board of directors that is arm's length to the members, if you will, the government, et cetera. And so you end up having a board of investment professionals at the end of the day. And over the years, even an even more professionalized board in the sense that you have investment professionals, HR professionals, operation professionals. So really structured almost like a public market board, if you will. And that governance structure really allowed for early day innovation into direct investing. And the reason why direct investing was much more feasible in that Canadian system, even over a decade ago now, was a combination of that arm's length approach, but also the ability to attract, retain, and compensate investment professionals in a way that's slightly different for sure than the way that most of the US pension plans are set up.
I spent 10 years as a trustee for a public pension plan, the Virginia Retirement System, and I'm obviously very familiar with the arm's length between government and giving it true investment professionals the opportunity to demonstrate their talent and execute their strategy. Talk to me a little bit about the governance, both that you've experienced now at CalPERS, which is somewhat famous for their governance, but also looking at how the model at CalPERS really gives you the flexibility to do what you need to do.
Sure. I'd say at CalPERS really does give us the delegated authority necessary in order for us to hit that long-term goal, if you will, of close to 7%. Because I think we realize that working together is the only way that we're going to be able to achieve that. But what that means on our end is that we have to be very transparent. We have to build up that trust with the board, and we have to make sure we're bringing one another along for what it is that we're, attempting to do. And so we work extremely closely with the board on strategic asset allocation, for example. It's a 4-year cycle, but every 2 years we are checking in with the board and having conversations around risk appetite, having conversations around what the implications are for different strategic asset allocation setups, if you will. And we're also spending a lot of time with the board, just giving them insights into what it is that's on our day-to-day mind, what it is that we're hoping to achieve, what tools we need to have, whether those tools are data and technology tools, whether those tools are, delegated authority or policy considerations, if you will, to give us the flexibility to deploy the capital in the way that's required to hit to achieve our return objectives. And so I find it to be a very collaborative environment. I think coming in, I had concerns. I didn't really know what it was going to be like working in a US pension governance system versus the Canadian system that I've previously described. But I'd say for the most part, as long as we're doing our part in being transparent and bringing the board along, they've been extremely supportive of our objectives to date.
So as you think about, you've talked a lot about the asset allocation, and that's an important relationship and agreement, frankly, between the board and the CIO. Talk a little bit more about the policy side. I think a lot of people outside of CalPERS think a lot about the policy, whether it's environmental or whether it's, any number of other things. Talk about how you translate the aspirations around policy for the board with actual, real, tangible investment strategies.
That's a good question. It's a complex question only because policy can mean very many different things to different people. When I think about the policies that are in place today, the tools that we've been given in order to deploy the capital in a way to make us a success, those types of policies are things around how much capital can we invest by asset class? Where can we invest the capital by asset class? What limits might we have, whether it's illiquidity limits or geographical exposure limits, et cetera. Those policies, I kind of think of them as rules of the road. And again, if there's a moment in time where we think that there are policies standing in our way, I can't even think of a single board meeting where the board hasn't openly asked me the question, are there any policies in place that are preventing you from delivering what it is that you're trying to deliver? And to date, the answer has been no. Where we get other different conversations, though, could come up, more, big P politics, if you will, where we're having conversations around what is your China exposure, or historically, what is your carbon footprint, or what is your Russia exposure? Those types of questions where legislature may come into play as well. Those are things that we have to make sure we are keeping on top of what's coming down the pipeline. And again, making sure we're extremely transparent with the board with respect to where we are along any one of those topics. And so we spend a lot of time with our members, with our stakeholders, with our board in educating our internal processes, or educating, how we're coming to investment decisions, or maybe educating the board on why we may not be leaning into certain areas, for instance, like China today. And so it really is kind of it's a bit of a give and take, I would say. But again, the board has been supportive on making sure that we're equipped with the tools we need when it comes to policy.
So there is a lot of discussion today about ESG, and we're
Mhm.
not going to get into the politics of that. That's not what we do here on Insights. But I know that it's important, right? Particularly the sustainable components and the environmental components. Given the evolving landscape of sustainable and responsible investing, how is CalPERS adapting its investment strategies to align with ESG?
Yeah, as you can imagine, we are spending a great deal of time. And in fact, one of the first things that Marcy and Marcy Frost, our CEO, and I partnered on when I joined was, how do we set ourselves up for success under this umbrella of sustainable investing? CalPERS for forever has been seen as a global leader in sustainable investing, certainly on the advocacy side. But what we wanted to do was to take it, a few steps further and start talking about, how do we weave in the risk management lens? How do we weave in the investing lens under this umbrella of sustainable investing? And so one of the very first hires that we made once I joined was to bring on a head of sustainable investing, for example. And then we started to just take a look at all of those verticals I just described. So what are we doing on advocacy? We felt like we were in a very good place, and we have a real track record there. But what more could we be doing in our path to net zero? And how do we wrap investing strategy around that? How do we take an ESG framework through a risk mitigation lens and make sure we're integrating that across our investment portfolio? And then finally, how do we think about our investing guidelines, our sustainability guidelines? And are we making prominent enough things like labor principles? Labor principles are extremely important to us, to our board, to our members, and to the investment team. And so tweaking or working more directly on items like labor principles, and near and dear to both of our hearts is making sure we are really promoting and pushing on diversity and inclusion, not only within our own investing teams, not only through the lens of our managers, but also through all the investments that we are making. And so those are examples of areas that we've really been bolstering and trying to really prioritize and elevate when we start talking about the areas that we find important.
So, Nicole, I'll let you in on a little secret. I have seen a number of CalPERS CIOs come and go in the job. And normally, the approach is we send them an intro letter from the NAIC. They often don't know who NAIC is. And I wax on and on about diversity, equity, and inclusion. You were the first CIO that beat me to the punch. You literally deployed $1 billion before I could get the letter off to you. And that caught my attention. The second thing that caught my attention is we obviously have a commonality between our partners. You chose two of NAIC's partners, GCM Grosvenor and TPG Next. And I've had the opportunity to work very closely with John Winkle-Reed and their amazing team, and have worked very closely with Michael Sachs and Derek Jones and their amazing team. But this is the moment for the interview. Tell us about how you arrived at one of your earliest decisions to deploy $1 billion, and walk us through how that process worked.
Sure. You know, even before I took the seat at CalPERS, kind of sitting in the midst of COVID like we all were, kind of in our home offices, I was off the side of my desk, really trying to think about how do I take my private equity investing background at the time as a partner of Redbird Capital and say, how do I take the network that we have at Redbird? How do I take the toolkit that I have and my own network with the Canadian pension plans and start putting a sharper point on raising capital to invest in diversity? And so I had already had a number of conversations about this extremely important initiative long before I even arrived at CalPERS. Then when I arrived at CalPERS and I saw that there was a true belief and a true desire to really be a thought leader and really be a catalyst maker, if you will, in investing in diversity, I didn't hesitate to, you know, make sure that that was a top priority for the team, because the team and the board and the executive here were all aligned in that wish and in that desire. And so it ended up just being very serendipitous that we were able to corral the team, corral the executive, get the support from the board to really try to kick off what we wanted to just be the catalyst. We certainly never said $1 billion is anywhere near enough to deploy into the initiative, but we absolutely wanted to be the catalyst to show other institutional investors that we know all the excuses why it's difficult to invest in emerging and diverse managers. Programs are small, track records are different, diligencing those types of opportunities is different, and it's hard. But we didn't want that to be the excuse. We wanted to demonstrate that if you can find great strategic partners like we did with Grosvenor and TPG, then really it's not only just about investing, but it's about building the network for these up and coming emerging and diverse managers. It's about building toolkits for them so that they themselves can be more efficient or better investors out of the gate and benefit from the decades of knowledge that regular way managers, let's call, non-diverse managers have had. And so really our intent was, number one, be the catalyst and kind of put our own capital where our mouth is. But number two, make sure we're bolstering the whole ecosystem, if you will, through mentoring as well as providing tools. And
Yeah,
so
one of the
so we had great support. The team really, jumped right on it. As I said, our board was extremely excited and proud that we could be putting our foot forward on the initiative, and the rest is history.
So it's been about 7-8 months now, I believe. How are the programs going?
Well, I'd say, I'm super proud of the progress made already. In late May, I'm going to get my days, all the days blend together, but we had a conference that we called our Catalyst Conference that we co-sponsored with CalSTRS. And really the intent there was, let's be the curator of let's bring everyone together in under one room. Let's bring the allocators in the room across the US and Canada. Let's bring the up and coming managers that are seeking capital in the room. And let's bring some of those advisors in the room too. And so we ended up having over 700 participants for 2 days of one-on-one meetings. We called them our speed dating meetings, where we could connect the allocators with the managers. And these managers were thrilled to have the opportunity to get the audience of allocators that they just normally wouldn't have access to. So that was a huge hit. The next part that I was super proud of is the allocators came to us and said, wow, you're right. It's not like we're short on product out there. It's not like we're short on opportunity. So just knowing that we are educating the broader market, that there are tremendous areas to generate alpha through the diversity and inclusion lens was just a huge, huge win. And finally, as I mentioned earlier, the mentoring and the providing of toolkits, we were able to announce that both of our partners at Grosvenor and TPG have already created specific tools for this group so that they too can be, a huge success as they kick off their funds. And so that traction alone has been great. I've already started to hear about the seeding and the investing to date that's already happened under both of those umbrellas. And so we're just delighted at where we're at so far.
Well, please accept, on behalf of NAIC and our members, please accept my sincere congratulations. We're very proud of what you all have done. We stand ready to be a partner as you endeavor to do more. Speaking of that, I don't know if you're going to break any news today, but I do want to always give you an opportunity. What's down the road relative to these programs and additional opportunities?
Well, it'll be a 1 year anniversary, if you will, by year end. And so we're taking close tabs on how the momentum has been. I know there have been a number of allocators that directed, guided towards both TPG and Grosvenor to join us. We opened up the conference that we held, the Catalyst conference, by saying, like, this isn't just for us to be a part of. We are welcoming, and this is a call to action for all other allocators to join us in this. And so my hope is that by the 1 year anniversary, we're going to be able to, applaud and celebrate the other allocators that have joined us on this mission to change the data, change the facts that so few diverse managers, 3% when you're looking just through one lens, women GPs. We need to change the statistics, and we can only do that if more than just CalPERS and CalSTRS capital is at work. And so we're hopeful that by year end, we'll be able to report back on a number of other allocators who have joined us.
So, Nicole, I want to shift a little bit, staying around the diversity theme, but really giving you an opportunity to talk about the challenges, unique challenges that women face in the industry. Obviously, you have surmounted the career curve and achieved the highest level, at least as it relates to institutional investors. But as you know, there are too many rooms that we both find ourselves in where there aren't any women, and there aren't enough women that are given the opportunity. Take a moment to share your perspective on what the industry as a whole should be doing to help promote women and give women a broader opportunity.
Yeah, I think, let's just start with educating young women on what opportunities actually exist in capital markets.
Mhm.
I like to tell the story of, I didn't know what investment banking was. What I knew was that these investment banks were coming on campus and giving, university students who are starving and poor free cocktail and snacks. And so those open sessions were, the only way that I would have even known what was going on in the so-called, investment banking world at the time. And now
Mhm.
fast forward, I'm not going to age myself, but decades later, I
Mhm.
think a lot of the universities and even some high schools are starting to do a much better job at educating women in asset management in general. And I think that's where we really need to start. And then, there's lots of programs that we call mentoring programs, but really what we need to be focused on is creating more champion programs. Like, mentors are great for grabbing coffee and, seeking advice on your resume, but really what young women have to do is seek out real champions. And they don't have to be females, although that's wonderful if you're able to find, a female mentor, for example, but just champions in general who are going to pound the table for you, look out for you for your career, guide you through, the tough bumps that come in anyone's career, but really to have a champion by your side. And I don't think we talk enough about what it means to be a champion versus a mentor. So I think doing more education around that is another important thing. And then I think just women to women, women need to support other women, frankly, better. We need to, stop being afraid that there's only room for one of us in a boardroom or one of us in an executive suite, and really make a much more concerted effort to be pulling other women up through the ranks and being their champion and owning that ourselves.
Yeah. No, powerful answers. Education, champion, and then women to women peer support. Let me just take one, champions. I'm very fond of the word champions and the concept, and I do think the evolution from talking about mentors versus talking about champions who literally will advocate for you is important. Can you talk to us a little bit about your champions? You don't have to name them, you can if you'd like, but talk about the role they've played in your career. When were those central moments where they talked about you for the opportunity when you weren't in the room, or they channeled you along a different path? Talk about the roles of champions in your career.
Yeah, if I think back to, you know, very early days in my careers. First of all, just having champions to give you a shot, to say, well, you may not necessarily have what you think is required to put your hand up for this job, Nicole, but you should put your hand up for this job. What's the worst that can happen? You don't get the job. And so having, mentor champions in those early days to be looking out for opportunities for me was a huge, huge benefit to me. It certainly allowed me, I'll use the example during my time at Ontario Teachers, to not just, be in my comfort zone of doing direct investing or private equity investing. It then, sent me to Asia and then sent me back to Canada to run public markets, for example. Those weren't just ideas that I had come up with by myself. I needed to have real mentors and champions to really kind of tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, you really need to be thinking about doing this if you're serious about progressing your career. And so that's been helpful. I think, where you can get a ton of benefit too, though, is those humbling moments where you have mentors say, you know what, I think you should try a different approach. I think maybe you need a different tone. I know this is a tough crowd, but you need to think about working with and learning, looking through a different lens or using a different approach. Those moments in my career where you have a mentor who's really looking out for your success and isn't just looking to kind of puff you up, but is also willing to kind of bring you down a bit and say, hey, you need to, have a moment of humility and think about a different approach here. And I have found both of those types of champions to be so instrumental in my career along the way. And I hope that I too am now able to do that type of mentoring as well with my own peers, colleagues, etc.
So, Nicole, as I think about my own job, I spend a lot of my time advocating for diverse managers. That's the job. That's what I'm supposed to be doing. But there's a broader universe beyond the diverse managers, which is the general market managers that are hiring as many people, have as many jobs, if not more, than exist in the emerging manager space. What's your perspective on the role that traditional, I don't want to call them non-diverse, but the traditional broader market firms, bulge bracket firms have in terms of giving people opportunities and making sure that they're diversifying their talent force as well?
I mean, this is something that all business leaders need to be extremely focused on. I mean, let's just start with diverse decision making makes for better decisions. So why would anyone, um, you know, allow themselves to have it any other way other than to bring diversity around the table for decision making? I think now, it is part of the fabric of many organizations that are demanding that this be an extremely important initiative, an extremely important priority across organizations. And so I think any firms at this point, if they're not talking constantly about how to improve diversity in their organizations, then they're not going to be sustainable organizations at the end of the day.
Does CalPERS take any further steps in terms of its compliance, in terms of talking to their managers about their aspirations to see them leverage diverse teams, or is that baked into the decision to hire them? So I guess I'm talking about proactive engagement and nurturing
Yeah.
them, or only hiring the ones that you believe get it.
Yeah, I think it's been, like many organizations, I think we've been evolving and we've been doing better, but there's always room for improvement. And so a number of years for a number of years within our principle or investment principles and guidelines, it's stated in those investment principles and guidelines that our principles are, absolutely include the importance of diversity, for example. We've now recently taken a further step, if you will, to really elevate those as part of our overall labor principles. And we'll have, GPs attesting that everyone understands how important all of these principles are to us, as an example. We have started a ESG data convergence project. Again, this was right before my time, but it's a project where we have a number of it's a partnership across a number of organizations where we're going out to all of our GPs and asking them to report on very specific, we're not boiling the ocean because we want participation, but reporting on very specific ESG data metrics. And
Mhm.
one of those very important data metrics is that it is a group of questions centered around diversity in those GPs. And we are making it very known and very well understood to our GPs that this is important to us and is absolutely a part of how we do overall diligence, because we think it's a risk if diversity and inclusion is not a priority for a GP at the end of the day. We think it's a risk to their business. We think it's a risk to their culture. And therefore, it's absolutely a part of our underwriting at the end of the day.
Yeah. So as I thought this summer about the commonalities between the markets of Canada and frankly California, environment is first and foremost, right? I mean, sadly, both California and Canada have experienced significant wildfires, seeing the challenges of a changing environment. Talk a little bit about how CalPERS thinks about the environmental aspects of its investments today. And again, I'm sure on this framework, you're asking questions about environmental practices and risks associated with environment as well. So talk a little bit about CalPERS and the environment.
Sure. Yeah, as I said, I think we've historically been known to be great advocates and have a very sophisticated advocacy strategy around climate issues. I think now is the time for us to be a lot more thoughtful and, more take more of an initiative, if you will, into investing more sustainably. And so, one of the areas that we're focused on, right now and working through and we'll be presenting to our board in the coming months is what is our path to net zero strategy, and how do we take today we have about 40 or so billion of what we would define as kind of climate smart type investments. How do we more than double that, if you will, over the coming, five or so years, so that we can really demonstrate that we're putting our capital, again, put our money where our mouth is. And so working through asset class by asset class where the opportunities exist, anything from energy transition thematics that we might be able to deploy capital through either our infrastructure program, our real estate program, or private equity or venture program, through to how are we measuring and tracking our own our own our own progress, if you will, on our own carbon footprint. And if we're going to invest from brown to green, for example, to try to help the heavy emitters become cleaner. Because again, we're not trying to just solve for our own portfolio. We're really trying to solve for the broader markets problem around climate issues. And so part of that strategy likely entails us investing in, a brown to green strategy. And so over time, we're going to want to monitor and track how we're doing with our own carbon footprint, with an understanding and with the education that our footprint may go up for a wee bit before it comes down, but the end game is to really have an impact on the entire, globe, if you will, as opposed to just the CalPERS investment portfolio. So we have a number of initiatives. And again, I mentioned earlier, it started with for, hiring for the role for somebody to oversee. Peter Cashin oversees our sustainable investing program. We are tooling him up with resources, both people and capital. And we're really excited about the progress the team has made. And we'll go to the board seeking approval for what we're calling our path to net zero strategy.
That's awesome. So I want to talk about one more area of
Sure.
investing before we sort of do a forward look. And really that area goes back to who CalPERS is as an organization. I want to talk about venture.
Hmm.
And venture obviously falls within the private equity bucket. You mentioned
Hmm.
earlier that you guys did a reset on private equity, but a lot of people don't understand that the successes that our economy has had over the years, and many of the startup companies that we know to be, powerhouse companies today, were early investments that CalPERS participated in. Talk about where venture capital is as an industry and where you all are as an investor in venture capital.
Yeah, it was interesting when we have, again, we started the conversation today with how large our program is. And so, any amount of capital from a dollar perspective is going to sound like a large dollar. But at the end of the day, it's, if we put a few $1 billion to work in venture, for example, that isn't really moving the needle on almost half a trillion program. And so that's kind of where we're at. We have kind of been woefully underweight, if you will, in venture investing in recent times. And so there was a great article that I read, and I try not to read the press on us too much, but it was interesting because it sounded like we were going to put all our eggs into a venture basket. That is not the case. I think right now is actually an interesting time. There's some real dislocation, and our objective is to get into the best performing managers that perhaps prior we weren't really able to get access to. And so if you think about the relative size of our program today, it's teeny tiny. Even if we deploy a few $1 billion a year into venture, which would be very difficult to do, but even if we did do that, then we would still be, it's still a very small slice of our overall strategic asset allocation. So what does this mean? What it means is that we have refreshed and again started to tool up. We've hired more resources to come in and look at venture. We're being very strategic in making sure that we are taking this opportunity today where many are over allocated to venture, and there's some interesting secondary buy opportunities right now. And so we're making sure that we are putting the capital to work and who we think are going to be the venture capital winners of tomorrow. And so it's a pretty tight list, and we have a lot of capital to deploy, but you have to right size it for the asset class. And so we are spending our time trying to build up that program. And so we are busy in that market, and we are open for business for any endowments that find themselves today a little over allocated. Give us a shout. We're interested in looking at the programs. And so we are spending time there. We're also spending time on the co-investment side as well. Again, we've been tooling up our in-house capabilities to be ready position to execute on more co-investments, whether it's in private equity or venture. And so we're really excited about the time we're in right now for market dislocation around venture because we have liquidity. We're open for business to build that program.
So, moving out of the asset classes and sort of getting broader perspective, when you think about what we're facing today, significant market volatility, dislocation in a number of areas, new technology threats and opportunities. So, you've got artificial intelligence, but you couple that with also cybersecurity threats. What do you think 5 years, 10 years from now, what are we going to look back and think about, and how will we regard this period of time, both from a vintage year standpoint, as well as, was it a good time to invest, or was it, the beginning of a challenging time to invest? How are we going to look back on this period of time?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question because you can kind of look at it two ways. Do I think the next period of time we're going to feel some pain? I do. I think that's why, when we think about our own, where we're spending our a big chunk of our time, we talk about innovation and resiliency. We're trying to build both innovation and resiliency into our investment program because we do think that, the next 10 years is not going to look like the last 10 have looked. And therefore, we're going to have to dig a little harder to generate alpha at the end of the day. It means we're going to have to tool up on our own tech stack, our own data and technology strategy, for example. We're going to need to think initiative into the sustainable investing piece that we were referring to earlier. And we're going to have to make sure we have the right in-house capabilities to execute on what I think, to part of your question, is going to actually be an interesting vintage, because whenever you have dislocation, if you have the right tools in place to, to really dive into those dislocations, they do tend to be more interesting vintage years. And so the benefit, as I said earlier, that we have right now, because on one hand, we were a bit late to the game on the private market side of things, we have a lot of liquidity. And so we're looking at making sure we're tooled up on risk management, tooled up on liquidity management, and that we have the right resources in place to, be thinking strategically right now during this period of time that I think we're going to feel a lot of sideways movement with respect to returns, unlike some of the nice lofty return profiles we've seen in recent years.
No, that's a great answer, and I appreciate that. Final two questions. So
Sure.
as you think about, you can start things as CIO, and you can stop doing things at CIO. You can start doing things faster. You can start doing things slower. But changing the landscape is difficult. If you could change one thing about the factors you face, the hand you've been dealt, what would you change and why?
That's a great question. No one has asked me that question before. Um, I think we're spending a lot of time right now on defining through a culture lens, what does it mean to be best in class? And
Mm.
what would it take through the culture lens to be a best in class pension investor, if you will? And so I think, you know, anytime you try to change culture, that's a long journey. And this is a big tanker to be moving as
Mhm.
well. And so if I had to change anything, I'd ask for a magic wand to just magically all wake up one day and feel like we're really close to hitting, everything needed to be best in class. The
Mhm.
positive is that the momentum and the ownership, if you will, of this investments team to truly want to be a high performing team, to truly be able to, deliver the pension promise that we've made to our members, there's a ton of momentum there. There's a ton of want. And so it's making us look at everything, as I said earlier, from do we have the right technology in place? Are we investing in the right markets? Are we agile enough? Do we have the right um, you know resources in place to do more things like co-investing? Example, are there other active um, active risk type programs that we should be thinking about? So we've really left no stone unturned with under this umbrella or under this north star, if you will, of being best in class pension plan. And so that's been a really amazing and rewarding journey to watch transpire over the last year and a half with the team. And it's really been the team that's really embraced this notion of we know we can get there. And it's just been so rewarding to watch.
Well, you nailed that answer. Big question, and I really appreciated your focus on being best in class. So, my last question for you is really an opportunity for you to direct your perspective and your insights to the young professionals. We have a number of college students, be they former interns or others that are aspiring to get into the field. What's the recipe for creating a successful and rewarding career based upon Nicole's experience and what you've seen in the marketplace? What advice can you give young professionals who want a career in investing but need to understand how to do that?
Yeah, I think, I say this to my kids a lot, and certainly now because I've one who just started her second year of university, and one is who's a high school senior about to get into college. And so, I always start with if you love what you're doing, it's never going to feel like work. And that's whether it's, love what you're doing study wise or love what you're doing in your job. So, really looking for something that you love. It might not be your biggest passion. I mean, I'll use a Canadian analogy. What young boy doesn't want to be an NHL player? So maybe you can't do what is completely your passion, but if you do something you truly love, then you're going to find great success in that. And when you find that thing that you love, if you build a reputation for working really hard and being kind to people, it's really hard for you to not start having champions. People are going to want to see you succeed when you develop that work ethic, with the envelope of kindness, if you will. And I guess the last one would just be, build those networks and don't be afraid to do, lateral moves early in your career. I think there's this, anxiety around climbing a ladder and promotions and, working just to go up, up, up. I think the first 10 years of my career, the best experience and the best base that I got was having, multiple tools put in my toolkit. I was seconded to operating roles in companies. I sat on boards. I, you know, worked front office, back office, direct deals. I took a stint in even fund investing to make me a better investor. I really tried multiple roles without being super focused on the career trajectory, and I think I really benefited from that. So not to be afraid of those, think of it more as a lattice, as opposed to just a ladder.
Well, Nicole, this was a fabulous interview, in part because you have been, frankly, so available and open to us. So I thank you for your candor. I hope that it comes across that NAIC is here to be supportive of CalPERS, but also of you. We want to make sure that we play our role, but we really appreciate the focus that you're having on so many things, from the environment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, to building a broader team, and obviously from your own mouth, building a best-in-class organization. So on behalf of the NAIC members, thank you so much for your time today.
And thank you. Thank you so much for your partnership. It truly means a lot. And I think, working together, we can get so much more accomplished.
I agree. Take care, Nicole. See you soon.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.